Good morning, everyone. As a designer, I think our role is to define and create culture. And at its best, we think that design can define human progress and really help drive the experience that people have with one another and with companies forward. Our company 8 was founded as an experience design firm and has worked with many respected companies, best known for the work with Apple, but have been working in this process for a number of years. And so we were invited into this conversation to look at the intersection of how business and the thoughts and processes we bring to commercial endeavors can connect with government and ultimately can play a role in creating better human outcomes. To me, great leaders create great experience. And one of the key things that we found with people, Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, people who are respected in successful business, is that they focus on creating great experience. And I believe you can also attribute design success to government as well as political leaders. Design can change the way that people think, feel, and do things. And ultimately, government, in its greatest potential, can probably have the greatest impact in changing people's lives. So the definition of government, according to Wikipedia, says that it's a collective will to define the way to live. If I apply this thought to experience design, I would say that government is an expression of a core set of values that people experience. And so the focus becomes how to design human experience. Our job is to design for human outcomes and let those outcomes deliver the business outcomes. And it must come from an inherent understanding of what it is to be successful from a human perspective, ultimately connecting people to a meaningful relationship. And the experience part is a way to define how we connect, essential qualities that drive the economic and human outcomes, but creating value creation in a way that in a competitive environment increases the value and increases the output of the business or the government, both from a distinctiveness perspective as well as from an emotional value. If this is done successfully, you can say that you've achieved return on experience, that you've created value. And in a 30-year practice, we see this value creation as working across not only business categories, but across diverse organizations. And so if we're looking to create return on experience, these are essentially the 8 key points that we would look at to help unlock the potential and to drive stronger connections. The first is recognizing that human experiences are holistic. We experience things holistically as human beings. We tend to be trained in silos, we tend to work in silos, but ultimately, if you're looking at experience, people experience this across a range of elements. And so in this case, people connecting with the values of an organization or a government through 4 primary experience realms: the environments, the products and services, the behaviors, and the communications. And it requires an understanding that we're looking at very complex creatures, that people don't really fit neatly into categories such as users and consumers, but they're far more interesting as a result if we look at it from that perspective. The second point is uncommon insights. And this is really the key to understanding what is relevant and how we develop deeper understanding of the people that we're looking to connect with. Ultimately, it's a way of defining the opportunities that define a higher purpose in what we're doing. This is Professor Scott Galloway's new algorithm of value. And what this is essentially an expression of the most successful companies out there and how they remain to a competitive advantage. And the idea that, such as when you do a search on Google, Google gets smarter. It's a function of the number of receptors, which are different touch points that companies have with their audience, and then ultimately the intelligence that they gather from that. You don't want to be in the magazine department, I think, in this competitive environment. But the most successful companies use the receptors and intelligence to not only inform their product, but to understand their customer behaviors and their brand, but also to inform a way and establish a new kind of dialogue with their audience. And so this is an example of a solution where the feedback loop is very critical. What we found is there's a shift today from a mono-channel, from a omni-channel strategy with many retailers and people are talking about, to now a more mono-channel strategy. The idea that we are all present physically and digitally simultaneously. And it's more important when we look at younger generations, particularly Gen Z, who are digital natives, who have grown up with technology. We ultimately have the ability to connect with them simultaneously, both physically and digitally, in a much more powerful way than when we think of them as separate channels. And the example here for Xiaomi in China is the idea that by creating a stronger connection, both physically and digitally together, we're able to 10x the experience and the value performance of the business, but 100x the receptors and intelligence that is derived from those interactions. The third point, not many consultants will tell you, beware of best practices is something that we always look at, because when you're thinking about experience, it's essential to understand that it's what differentiates you as opposed to what makes you similar to others that's a key opportunity. And so most companies look at best practices to improve operations or to improve efficiency, and that's fine. But it may be misplaced when you're looking for a competitive edge from an experience standpoint. And when we look at these competitive edges, it's really about defining that distinctiveness, what it is that makes you different. The research shows that 80% of CEOs believe their product is differentiated, and only 8% of customers agree. This is a remarkable statistic when you think about it. And the reason is most CEOs will work very hard to create a differentiated product, but ultimately deliver it in the same way as their competitors. So when they look at their peers, they deliver the experience the same way as their peers. And ultimately, it commoditizes what you're offering. And the same is true in any type of service or public engagement. The fourth point is about empathy. And it's not just important in design, but it's ultimately one of the fundamental qualities that helps make us successful in any type of human interaction. It's ultimately able to create deeper understanding and more meaningful connections. In this case, a new way of thinking about adding sports fields to Bangkok, where people decided that the one thing that they couldn't do was change the world around them, so they inserted these football fields into very odd-shaped and unique types of applications. Ultimately, the human outcomes lead to business outcomes, but the key metric in this research is on the far right-hand side, which is really looking at the value that's created from an emotional perspective when you create a positive emotional engagement and the participation that you get as a result. Ultimately, 6 times more likely to engage or purchase, 12 times more likely to recommend the company, become advocates for the company, and 5 times more likely to forgive you if you make a mistake. The fifth point is about word of mouth. And McKinsey research says that 50% of purchases are the result of word of mouth, but 80% of word of mouth comes from direct experience. So if you're not looking at designing the experience, you're probably leaving value on the table as a result. Nike leveraged the situation in America with Colin Kaepernick protesting the treatment of black people in the country by kneeling during the football games. At a certain point, the issue became very heated in America, and Nike decided to make a statement by launching the 30th anniversary of Just Do It by featuring Colin Kaepernick and the idea of standing for something that you believe in, and ultimately it means giving up everything as a result. The business outcome for Nike was running now at $163.5 million worth of media coverage, They received $43 million worth of media coverage in their first 24 hours of the launch of the campaign, and increased year-on-year sales of their products 31% as a result of stating what they stand for and then standing for what they say. The sixth point is risk and taking risk. I always use Apple as an example here. The night before we opened the first store, Steve was sitting on one of the tables, and he asked us what happens if nobody comes tomorrow. And at that moment, we were a little shocked, but we were also concerned because it was something that he had some reservations about. And in a big part, it was due to the fact that there were many people who were essentially saying that this concept, this idea would be a failure. And ultimately, because there was no precedent for it. The fact that there was no precedent made it risky. Because it was risky, you shouldn't do it. And ultimately, it comes down to maybe a different way of looking at it. The next 10 years later, Bloomberg wrote a much better article. We were doing $36,000 a square foot in sales. But the real risk for Apple wasn't spending a few $1 million on developing their retail program. The real risk would have been listening to the pundits and not doing anything. So the idea of not trying something is just as risky as trying something and failing. Ultimately, then the shift to the first trillion-dollar company, and probably one of the greatest impact in terms of the experience with the Apple company. The end result was driving passion, loyalty, and creating advocacy. Much of the success of the program came from the advocacy that was created with people. So understanding the human interaction and being able to create a core belief around that. And the seventh point is irrational loyalty. And ultimately, we look at things where we can help define things that sort of defy your normal or rational understanding and be able to build on that. How do you create an experience that is sticky? You need to build deeper connections, but also get other people to become your advocates. And we know this with government services and many other things, that if you can get other people to share what you believe, you can have a very powerful impact. Ultimately, it means moving up the ladder in terms of, this is Niemeyer's states of being, but moving from participation and engagement to happiness and well-being as a part of this target. And we know that experience is a combination of things. Ultimately, these combination of things that lead to better experience. As with companies, nations have KPIs and that others use to quantify your success. And ultimately, we believe this better human outcomes will lead to return on experience. And the eighth point, return on experience, we believe is always better return on investment. That the focus on experience ultimately is delivering better investment in terms of your activities. Singapore is 50 years old. Many countries, both large and small, look at Singapore as their best practices as well as new ideas. And one of the key things is Lee Kuan Yew, who founded the country, was commonly noted as an extraordinary politician, an extraordinary leader. We see him as also an extraordinary designer. And I think great designers deal with complex issues in ways where they can put together solutions that look at the common good and look at ultimately the types of outcomes that the ecosystem you're creating can deliver. And so if we reframe what he's doing through designing human experience, I think you can see how these different elements ladder in to a much more complex world, but ultimately being a nation where everything is considered and reviewed through a disciplined process is something that has helped make Singapore successful, given the various limitations that they have geographically. Ultimately, it's about transforming people's lives, and I would say that Lee Kuan Yew is really one of the people who has been able to help go in 50 plus years to a remarkable outcome.
They said we have nothing. No land, no hope.
Every time we look back on this moment when we signed this agreement with severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish.
They said we couldn't survive. They said we have no labor, no skill, no infrastructure. Create the world's best airline? They said no way. Change the face of transport across Asia? They said don't even try. Turn the city into a nighttime racetrack? Engineer a plaster that heals artery walls?
That's impossible.
$1 billion brand for gamers? Lead the world in martial arts? They said it was impossible.
So what we see ultimately is that an idea is not innovation. Innovation comes from adoption. And through adoption is one of the only ways that you can really demonstrate success. And what that means, in order to achieve adoption, that design has to be a very critical part of that conversation. How you do something matters. Google's greatest innovation is a rectangle. The fact that they simplified the entire experience to a rectangle is what makes them different from the many other search engines that preceded them. But the idea that how you design something will drive loyalty and will drive preference, and ultimately will drive successful solutions, provided it's considered through the lens of experience. And we've seen over the years that there's a consistency. Many of the clients that we have, many of the people that we've worked with, the consistency is that ultimately people who have made things that matter become ingrained in our culture, in our imagination. And it's the focus on the value of the experience, what really makes people connect with their products or their services. And so ultimately, if we think of this experience design in the context of government, the future way to create value, in our view, is to focus on better human experience. Thank you.